Now, the #1 story of the week, the cyber breach that federal agencies are cleaning up from could go down as the biggest and most damaging breach in history. The fingerprints on the attack point to a longtime adversary of the United States. Suzanne Spaulding is Senior Advisor of Homeland Security at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. She's former Undersecretary for the National Protection and Programs Directorate at the Department of Homeland Security. Jack Wilmer's Chief Executive Officer at Core4ce, former Deputy Chief Information Officer for Cybersecurity and CISO at the Pentagon. Folks, welcome. Thanks for joining me. Suzanne, I start with you. What is your takeaway from the reports that you've seen this week about this hack?
Well, there's so much we don't know yet, Francis. So we'll be getting lessons learned from this, disaster for quite some time. It is, as CISA recently said, very grave for our national security. But I think it is very telling that among the best cybersecurity experts in the world at FireEye were hacked. So it's an important reminder of what we often say, which is that a determined nation-state adversary particularly, given enough time, will be able to get into your system. And it doesn't mean that you give up or throw up your hands. It means you continue to make it hard for them to get in, make it hard for them to, once they're in, move around undetected, make it hard for them to exfiltrate data undetected. But it does mean that you have to operate on the assumption that bad guys will get into your system. And we talk about that. It is really hard to do, and very few people really do it. And it starts with identifying your high-value assets, and that means knowing what is of high value to your adversary, to the bad guys.
Jack Wilmer, same question to you. What do you take away from what you've read about this report this week?
Yeah, I'll agree with everything Suzanne just said. I think that, this is obviously an insidious attack. It's a huge potential scale. So when you look at potentially 18,000 organizations that have been impacted by it, that's going to be pretty substantial. And when you look at the fact that it's an advanced adversary who's been in these systems for a period of months, that's given them a lot of time to be able to hide and cover their tracks. And so I think it's going to be very difficult to get them out. The one other thing that I would add that is a really interesting takeaway was added in CISA's latest advisory, where they talked about the grave nature of this, and they said that the SolarWinds Orion compromise was not the only initial vector in that this adversary has used. So I think it'll be very interesting as we learn more about what some of the other vectors in have actually been, and the scope of this could get even bigger than we're looking at now.
Suzanne, what happens next logistically after an attack like this? Who does what? Triage, response, repair? What's the chain of events that will happen in the coming weeks?
Well, and of course, it's already begun. And we do have some lanes in the road. So the FBI is in there right away looking at trying to do that attribution. And it seems to be pretty clearly attributed to the Russians and, in fact, to the SVR, their intelligence agency, and presumably a group that we know about, although more recent information raises questions about that, whether this is a new group with new tactics and ways of operating. But they're doing that, and they're trying to get information that they can provide to CISA, the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency at DHS, that is responsible for what we call asset response. So they're responsible for helping to immediately kind of mitigate the damage, get information out to all of the people. And in this case, it's a lot of people in government and the private sector who need to understand how this happened. And as Jack says, multiple ways in which it happened, and try to stem the damage, and then help people understand how to mitigate it. So those are the two key players right now in terms of response, FBI and DHS. The White House has a very important coordinating role, and they've called the coordinating groups, the Unified Coordinating Group and the Coordination Response Group, to come together to develop plans, to share knowledge about what we know. They should be bringing members of the private sector who have key knowledge, like FireEye and perhaps some of the ISPs, et cetera, to help them understand this. But those are the major movements here. And of course, the intelligence community is doing everything it can to understand from its perspective, using its unique authorities and tools, what has happened here.
Jack, a lot of comparisons this week to the Office of Personnel Management breach in 2015. After the OPM breach, the CIO there, Donna Seymour, got just beaten up right and left from Congress especially about that breach, even though she wasn't entirely responsible. How does one attribute, if it's even possible, accountability within the federal government to this, or given Suzanne's comments that we should assume the bad guys are going to get in if they want to, is that even appropriate at this point in time?
Yeah, I think that, attribution is definitely going to be a really important topic over the next coming months. I think that's generally something that people will focus on once we've gotten through the triage of responding to the actual incident. So Suzanne talked a lot about the whole of government efforts that are going to occur in response to this in terms of the various groups that are stood up, sharing what's going on. And I think there's going to be a lot of activities inside of agencies just to determine the scope of the potential compromise, try and figure out how we can limit where the adversaries may have been able to go, and then focus the cleanup activities there. I think part of the interesting comparison between this and OPM is that with the OPM response, it was all about the data that was compromised, the data that the adversaries had access to. And I think what you're seeing with this is we're not even at that point yet. We just know that the adversaries have been able to get into some really sensitive and important networks for the government. And so I think that a lot more is going to happen as we start to understand what data was potentially put at risk or exposed. In terms of attribution itself, I think that there's a couple vectors that we'll probably look at. I think one is the company itself, SolarWinds, and how their security practices were. How did this initial supply chain compromise occur? I think to what Suzanne said earlier, I agree that if a nation state is willing to invest enough time and money in going after a company, they're probably going to be successful. But I think what you want to make sure of is that this was they had to use some kind of advanced techniques, not exploiting a basic cybersecurity issue. I think on the government side, where it gets really challenging is the fact that they're effectively using our best practices against us. I mean, one of the things that I know I preached for a long time in my role in the Defense Department was to try and make sure that we were as patched as possible. So as soon as these security patches come out, you want to make sure that you are deploying them so that you're closing off all those known vulnerabilities. And certainly we're aware of the potential of supply chain attacks, but this is the type of thing where, an agency might have done exactly what they're supposed to do, deployed the patches, deployed the exact patch that came from the vendor. And so I think that, and last thing I'll say in terms of that attribution is, what are the monitoring things that we had in place? So I think deploying the patch was, frankly, them operating as they should. The question now is, how should we have potentially detected these follow-on actions that the adversary took? And do we have the right capabilities in place to do that?
Jack Wilmer, Suzanne Spaulding, thanks both very much for your time today. I appreciate it.
Thank you.